Hello and welcome to the Just Here in the Dark podcast with me, your host, Sean. As always, you can check out the podcast on Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. You can also check out more creepy, weird content on my Instagram page, which is the Just Here in the Dark podcast on Instagram. But without any further ado, before we do that, and if you like the content, please share, like, comment. All of those will be very much appreciated. But without any further ado, let's get into our first story. Our first story comes to us from serialdispatches.com. Vicki Dawn Jackson was a vocational nurse at Nocona General Hospital in Nocona, Texas. A licensed vocational nurse in Texas needs 1 to 2 years of training. It gave her a chance to learn about paralytic drugs. Her drug of choice was Mivacron, a powerful muscle relaxant normally kept at crash carts. Whenever the drug went missing from the cart, the hospital would replace it. Jackson often targeted people who had slighted her. Orville Moore called her a fast ass. She went after her estranged husband's grandfather to get back at her husband. One young woman who survived, Lydia Diane Weatherred, had recently rejected Jackson's son's advances. After Weatherred entered the hospital, Jackson gave Weatherred an injection of muscle relaxant. On January 28, 2001, the young woman almost died following the injection. Between December 2000 and February 2001, Jackson murdered at least 10 patients at the Nocona General Hospital. Each received an overdose of the muscle relaxant Mivacron. At a high enough dose in an elderly or fragile patient, the victim would stop breathing. Hospital staff gossiped, but as is often the case, the murders continued. Because death in hospital is sometimes expected, news documentation about the deaths often occurred only after charges were laid. However, it appears Jackson's first victim was Donna Donnie Alice Jenkins, 100 years old. She died on December 11, 2000. Next was Sanford Ray Mitchell on December 20th, followed by Boyd Bruce Burnett on the 24th. Not yet done for the year, Jackson then gave a fatal dose to James Wesley Gore on the 29th. Jackson went to the bedside of 65-year-old Jimmy Jim Ray Holder on the night of January 7, 2001. She injected him with muscle relaxant and summoned other nurses to help. She stood by and watched him die. Dorothy Jean Vanderberg died the same day. 80-year-old JT Nicholas was in the hospital with pneumonia. It was his bad luck that it was Nocona General Hospital during Jackson's shift. She gave him an overdose of her drug of choice. He died on January 11, 2001, as did John Walter Williams. On January 24, 2001, 95-year-old Omar Oval Glenn Weiler was in the hospital. She suffered a congestive heart failure, but had been treated and was set to go home. Jackson gave her an injection of Mivacron, a potent muscle relaxant. Weiler stopped breathing. On January 30th, Orville Lee Moore Jr. made the mistake of calling his vocational nurse, Vicki Dawn Jackson, a fat ass. She injected him with Mivacron. He died at the age of 82. On February 4th, 2001, Everett E. Preacher Jackson was admitted to the Nocona General Hospital. He had cellulitis and a fever. Everett was the grandfather of Jackson's estranged husband. Jackson injected him with Mivacron. She let the other staff know Everett was dead. One of the other staff was Kurt Jackson, her estranged husband, who worked at the same hospital as a nurse's aide. Beginning in 2001, the families of many patients under Jackson's care filed a lawsuit against the hospital. They alleged the hospital was negligent, allowing Jackson to continue to work. Some families also sued other hospital employees for negligence. On June 11, 2001, authorities exhumed both Nicholas and Moore. then another 8 bodies. On July 16, 2002, police arrested Jackson after the grand jury earlier returned 2 indictments of capital murder. In 2005, the judge declared a mistrial due to the prosecutor's comment during the opening arguments. A new trial was set. Jackson pleaded no contest on October 3, 2006. On October 3, 2006, Jackson received a life sentence with parole eligibility in 40 years. This sentence covers the death of 10 patients. Due to privacy laws, there is some question as to precisely who those 10 people are. Jackson appears to have been found guilty for murder of Everett Jackson, Nicholas Weiler, Holder Jenkins, Mitchell Gore, Vanderberg, Williams, and more. She is suspected of dozens of similar murders that had gone undetected. On to our next story. Our next story comes to us from UPI.com. A 70-year woman had her intestines sucked out by a vacuum toilet in a bizarre accident aboard a cruise ship last September. A doctor reported in a letter to a medical journal. Dr. J. Brendan Wynn said Thursday he wrote the letter to the Journal of the American Medical Association to alert doctors and the public to the possible dangers of vacuum toilets, which are common aboard ships and airplanes. I realized this almost defies belief, Wynn said in a telephone interview. Wynn said he was vacationing aboard a Greek-registered Pegasus dock near Vancouver, British Columbia on September 22nd when he responded to an emergency call on the ship's loudspeaker. When he and his wife, a registered nurse, arrived at the women's cabin, they found her lying on the bunk with several feet of small intestines trailing behind her, Wynn said. The woman was taken to the Royal Columbian Hospital. Dan Van Keegan, Director of Communications of Royal Columbian, said the woman, a Phoenix resident, was admitted to the hospital where she was treated for 10 days and released. Van Keegan said no other information was available about the woman's present whereabouts, but the nurse said she left looking pretty okay. The Pegasus is currently on a South American cruise. This story comes to us from Medium.com. On June 6, 1992, Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall graduated from Kickapoo High School in Springfield, Missouri. They went out for a night of celebrations. The plan was to stop by several house parties and spend the night at their friend Janelle Kirby's house. But when they finally arrived at Janelle's at around 2 a.m., the house was too overcrowded. They decided to go back to Susie's house and sleep there. Nobody saw them ever again. On the following morning, June 7th, Janelle Kirby and her boyfriend waited for Susie and Stacy. They had all planned to go together to a water park. When the girls didn't show up at Janelle's house, she and her boyfriend went to pick them up. They arrived at Susie's house around 8 a.m. 3 vehicles were still parked outside, belonging to Susie, Stacy, and Susie's mother, Sherelle. The glass lamp on the porch was broken and the door was unlocked. Janelle and her boyfriend went inside. The purses of all 3 women were lined up on the living room floor and at the feet of the steps leading into Susie's bedroom. The dog, a Yorkshire Terrier called Cinnamon, was locked in the bathroom. But Sherelle, Susie, and Stacy were nowhere to be seen. While they were in the house, the phone rang. Janelle answered. A strange male voice on the other end started making sexual innuendos. She hung up. Soon, the phone rang again. The same voice. Janelle hung up again. Her boyfriend, meanwhile, innocently cleaned up the broken glass on the porch. And then they left. Several hours later, Stacy's mother, Janice, who had been getting increasingly worried, went to the house herself. She hadn't been able to reach Stacy by phone and knew she had decided to spend the night. She went inside and also noticed all 3 purses on the living room floor. She looked around in the other rooms. She recognized her daughter's clothes neatly folded on her sandals by Susie's waterbed. She also noticed that Sherelle and Susie, both chain smokers, had left their cigarettes in the house. Janice knew something was wrong. She called the police in a panic. When she hung up, she noticed a light blinking on the answering machine. Someone had left a message. She played it and later described it as strange. She couldn't remember more, and the answering machine had automatically erased the message after it played once. The police was baffled by the case. There was no sign of forced entry in the house. The 2 girls had by all appearances gotten ready for bed. There were damp washcloths in the bathroom. They had removed their makeup. There was jewelry left on the wash basin. In the purses left behind, police found wallets, IDs, car keys, and money. The dog was in the house. Nothing apart from the 3 women was missing. The television was turned on. Cheryl's bed appeared to have been slept in. Her eyeglasses were on the nightstand next to a turned-over book. The blinds in Susie's room were pulled apart as if someone was looking outside. An untouched graduation cake was sitting in the refrigerator. The officers started collecting evidence. Soon, it became clear that they had begun their investigation too late. By that point, over 16 hours after the disappearance, word friends and family had been coming to the house, somewhere between 10 and 20 people, probably tainting the crime scene. Also, the message on the answering machine had been lost, and the broken glass from the porch lamp, the single possible sign of forced entry, had been swept up and thrown in the trash. The police recovered all evidence they could, but we don't know whether anything crucial had vanished in the meantime. They started investigating people. The neighbors hadn't heard anything during the night. The last person to hear from Cheryl was a friend. Cheryl had called her on the night of her disappearance at 11:15 p.m. and told her how she was painting a chest of drawers. She gave no indication that anything was wrong. From that point, every trail picked up by the police went cold. Their first suspect was Susie's ex-boyfriend. He had been arrested for robbing graves, and Susie was allegedly going to testify against him. However, the police quickly ruled him out as a suspect. They also looked at Bart Streeter, Cheryl's son and Susie's brother. He was also ruled out. They apparently investigated the strange phone calls. The only official statement is that the 2 prank phone calls that Janelle answered were unrelated to the strange message that was later inadvertently erased by Janice, but no further information about these calls has been released. Over the years, many people have claimed to have leads on the case. In 1993, a man called Stephen Eugene Garrison was arrested on a weapon charge and claimed to know where the 3 women are buried as part of a plea bargain. He said a friend had drunkenly admitted to murdering them. Garrison supposedly had details about the case that were not released to the public. He led the police to a farm. No bodies were found. Robert Fox, convicted of kidnapping and robbery in Texas and a suspect in a Florida murder, claimed in 1997 to know what happened to the 3 women. He was in Springfield during the time of their disappearance, but had an alibi when questioned by the police. He was interviewed and brought to a grand jury. They did not indict him. He still maintained to know what happened, but said he'd reveal everything only after his mother dies. In 2007, a web sleuth by the name of Ken claimed to have had a psychic encounter with the spirit of Stacy. She had told him the bodies are buried under a parking garage of the Cox South